Hey, it's Eli, back again and only a week and a half late this time. So, some quick housekeeping before we get into the video. On my last video about Panera bread baker Tammy McCoy's battle with religious discrimination, a viewer by the name of Horned One posted a comment that provided contact information for Panera bread if anyone wanted to voice their concerns. That comment was flagged by YouTube, presumably for containing addresses and phone numbers, and by the time I caught it, the momentum had passed. I did approve the original comment, but it seems to have never appeared on the video for some reason, so I posted my own pinned comment containing the deleted information. Sorry about that, Horned One, and if anyone missed that information the first time around and wants to call or write Panera Bread, head back over to the video in the card above to get it. Now that that's out of the way, let's talk about Grant's peace policy. In researching this subject, I was fairly surprised by how little it gets discussed. Here on YouTube, for example, there appear to only be a few videos that discuss this event in any detail at all. So I think a lot of this may be new information for a lot of people out there. So what was the peace policy? Well, in short, it was an attempt by President Ulysses S. Grant, as part of the overall Reconstruction efforts that followed the Civil War, to end the constant fighting on the U.S. frontier and seek a peaceful solution to the land disputes between the United States and the First Nations. Grant took a number of actions in furtherance of this goal. He appointed Eli Parker, a Seneca military officer and the first Native American ever to be appointed to the post, as Commissioner of Indian Affairs. He withdrew all military personnel from the reservations and imposed stiff penalties on soldiers who overstepped their bounds. As a capstone to his plan, he replaced the military occupiers who previously controlled the reservations with avowedly pacifist religious organizations who, in his mind, would put peace and diplomacy first when engaging with the First Nations people. At the center of this movement stood the Quakers, which led a number of critics of the time to refer to it derisively as Grant's Quaker policy. The reasons for Grant selecting the Quakers were twofold. Firstly, the Religious Society of Friends had long had a reputation for especially good relations with the First Nations, and were accepted by a number of native populations who viewed other Christian groups with deep suspicion. Secondly, and certainly most importantly, was that Quakers were deeply associated with pacifism in the public consciousness. And that was the message that Grant wanted to send. Grant wanted, most of all, to replace the harsh military rule these reservations were currently subjected to with the kind, gentle hand of the Christian Church, backed and supported by all the resources of the state. The Quakers, for their own part, were elated by this chance to end the bloodshed on the frontier and show off the power of their pacifist message. But if you've been listening thus far, you probably don't need me to tell you that this plan turned out to be a disaster. For starters, while the missions had control of the reservations, the military still occupied all land outside of the reservations, and the line between who lived in and outside the reservation was a fuzzy one. While there were still so-called roaming bands of natives who refused to live on the reservations at all and were still actively at war with the United States, there were also a number of reservation residents who were willing to move to new homes but refused to completely accept the occupation of their land, and so continued to pass beyond the reservation borders in order to hunt. It was not uncommon for these people to be killed in spite of the so-called peace, and it was equally common for natives, both on and off the reservation, to organize raids on white settlements in retribution for these murders. This was an active war zone, and the Quakers, whether they understood it or not, were moving into occupied territory. While the Quakers were expected to hold to their pacifist beliefs, they still had the military at their back. They could call in troops from the nearest fort at any time to quell a rebellion or arrest troublemakers. Most, at first, hesitated to do this, seeing it as disruptive to their relationship with the people they were seeking to help. However, as the realities of war began to set in, and the Quaker custodians were exposed to a cycle of murder and raids they didn't know how to stop, there came a time when they had to pick a side and figure out whose peace they cared the most about preserving. As could probably be predicted, many allied with the white Americans they most resembled, and began to internalize the racism of the frontier, seeing the natives in their care not as people to be helped, but as savages to be controlled. In my research, I found a particularly poignant example of this in an article by Dr. Jennifer Graber entitled "If a War It May Be Called, The Peace Policy with American Indians," which details the rise and fall of a particular Quaker missionary assigned to the Kiowa Nation by the name of Lori Tatum. Tatum became the subject of a great deal of criticism within the Quaker community when he turned a group of Kiowa men over to the military for execution, who he believed to have been involved in a recent wagon attack meant to avenge the death of a Kiowa leader who had been killed several months earlier. There's a link to the full article in the description, and I recommend checking it out, but I want to include a small excerpt here that details the once optimistic Tatum's thoughts on the Kiowa in the years following the attack. He wrote that his decision to punish Indian raiding by withholding rations was new and experimental. He added that it worked grandly. Tatum also reported that after Satanta's imprisonment for the wagon train attack, he thought it would be a good thing for more Kiowa leaders to spend time in jail. He accounted for this position, claiming that firm restraint was the kindness I thought was needed. In reflecting on the war that exploded on the plains after he resigned, Tatum concluded that the resulting subjection and punishment the Indians experienced left them subdued. Yikes. This willingness to employ military force in order to keep the peace was not the only issue with the Quakers' plans to bring peace to the frontier, as even when they got what they wanted and had few issues with raiding and rebellion, the best-case scenario for the natives on these reservations was still cultural genocide. Those Quakers who did not go the way of Tatum and rely on violence to subjugate the people in their care often set about instead trying to educate and assimilate them. Enrolling native children in highly restrictive Indian schools meant to, and this is straight from the mouth of those who advocated for these schools, kill the Indian to save the man. Native religions, languages, and cultural practices were wiped out en masse, and children who refused to give up their traditions were harshly treated, being beaten, denied food, or even put in isolation in order to ensure they submitted to acculturation. The terrible legacy of the Indian schools is still felt today, and these institutions probably did more to destroy Native American culture than any of the armed occupations that preceded them. So why did this all go so terribly wrong? And what does that have to do with the problems we're facing today? And why the hell do I have a Bernie Sanders picture in my thumbnail? Let's start with the first question. Why did this all go so terribly wrong? The problem, in my view, is that the Quakers and other religious leaders put in charge of these reservations never really had the interests of the natives at heart. Their values, at the end of the day, were still in line with the values of the state. They didn't care about the claim of the natives to the land or see their fight to preserve their way of life as valid or worth backing. They just wanted the fighting to stop, and to them, that meant the natives needed to give up and submit to American rule. When they refused to roll over for their new peace-loving overlords and accept what essentially amounted to terms of surrender, these Quaker custodians were shocked that these people would not want peace, a peace they always intended to be offered only on their own terms. The term peace, from the very beginning, was used as a smokescreen to make it seem like what the natives wanted was war. The idea of the First Nations as autonomous nations with a valid claim to the land was dismissed from the very beginning, never even part of these plans for peace. Given all this, how could such a plan ever work? This brings me to the next two questions, and what this video is really about. It took me long enough, right? What does this have to do with the problems we're facing today, and why is Bernie Sanders in my thumbnail? The problem with the peace policy was that it didn't really respect the people it nominally wanted to help. You can't just fight the symptoms of oppression while working to uphold the system that gives rise to it. We, as leftists, seek to empower the working class. Wherever there are marginalized people being exploited by capitalism, we say we stand together with them in their fight. But the common trend in leftist politics in the West seems to be toward reform and social democracy, a system that seeks to retain the capitalist system of exploitation while trying to put bounds on it and ensure a broad social safety net in spite of it. This does not and cannot solve the problems of capitalism, and it'll fail for the same reason the peace policy fails. It doesn't actually respect the plight of the working class, and ultimately relies on exporting exploitation to less developed countries in order to offset the costs of improving the quality of life at home without actually changing anything. Making sure your own people have free healthcare and college while continuing to funnel most of the money to a few wealthy dinosaurs can only be achieved by increasing exploitation of the working class somewhere else. Like Grant's vision of peace, this vision of socialism ultimately only applies to the benefactors of hegemony themselves. And like Grant's vision of peace, it's a smokescreen. If the Quakers really wanted to help the Native Americans, they should have allied with them and joined their fight to be accepted as nations, rather than working as arms of the state to execute their political dissidents, erase their culture, and manufacture consent, all in the name of some nebulous, ill-defined peace. They should have fought for what was right, rather than for what was most comfortable for people like them. Likewise, if we really want to stand with the oppressed, that means really standing with them, both inside and beyond our borders, by fighting to end the capitalist system of oppression, not just export it. So that's it. Thanks for making it to the end of the video. I'm actually torn on where to go with next week's video, so how about helping me out? Do you want me to try my best to get into the twisted mind of our first Quaker president, Richard Nixon? Explore the deep-running influence of Gnostic Christianity on the mythology of the Elder Scrolls universe? Or discuss the misunderstood and unfairly maligned Christian symbolism in Little Nas X's Montero? Let me know in the comments. Have a good night.